What's up, guys? Welcome to the 100 greatest black saxophone players of all time. And I've had a few people in some of the Facebook groups be like, why are we doing it by race? And I can give you a lot of reasons why. You know, for one, it was too difficult dividing it by alto, baritone, tenor, soprano, because everybody switches around too much. So I couldn't do it that way. You know, is this guy baritone? Is he? It didn't make sense. White and black was a simple way to divide it. And the racial lines in this country are clearly defined in so many cases. And I know I've kind of already said this a few times, but I learned some things doing it that way. Those 50 white players were very educated. A lot were composers and arrangers. A lot easily moved on into show business and the Vegas lounges. They used jazz as a stepping stone in their career in a lot of ways. It didn't mean they didn't enjoy it when they were a young guy and felt that they were a part of it and played with integrity. They did. And they had great education and knowledge in music. But it also illustrates how, on some level, it wasn't a necessity to play this music. They liked it, and it felt kind of rebellious in their youth to like that black music. You know, and okay, I feel this, and they got into it, and a lot of those guys swung hard and played hard. But as history has showed us, a lot of them are no longer part of the jazz lexicon. And then now we're going to dive into these 100 black artists, and what's going to shock you, because it surprised me, is just how long the list of black saxophone players is of pretty well-known names. You know, and that's a real 180 from the white experience, which was they were well-known names that no one knows now, versus these were names that very few people, especially in the white buying public, knew. And now it's what most of the white buying public knows. I'm wearing Pops today. I know we're talking saxophones, but when it comes to this music, he's the foundation that it stands on. Personality, improvisation, emoting, inflecting himself into a song, making it his own by how he's spinning the yarn. Armstrong's a special part of this history and always deserves recognition whenever you get the chance. So that being said, number 100, and this guy certainly blurs the lines. Sam the Man Taylor. And Sam the Man Taylor has a great tone. He's got a lot of blues roots in him, even though he ends up doing a rather R&B, almost pop jazz into the 60s, and ends up in Japan as a very popular like jazz artist, as it were, doing songs like Harlem Nocturne and It's a Blue World. Sam the Man was born July 12, 1916. Real early in Lexington, Tennessee. Influenced by guys like Cootie Williams. He played with Lucky Millinder, Cab Calloway, Ray Charles, Bud Johnson, Louis Jordan, Big Joe Turner. He was a regular session guy in New York in the 50s on a lot of different labels, including RCA and some of the jazz labels. Harlem Nocturne is a song that I kind of really associate with him. And then Shake, Rattle, and Roll by Big Joe Turner, that's him on the saxophone. He's on the Honey Drifters, the chord song Shaboom. He really kind of shows up in a lot of pop crossover places, and he's kind of the perfect guy for it. And again, like I said, in the 70s, he was a huge star in Japan. I could almost see myself walking to some Japanese sake den and seeing Sam the Man Taylor in the corner laying down these sweet, oh so sexy, bluesy, but somewhat saccharine sax parts. It's the only record I have by him. He's got a fairly large discography. His roots are firmly in the blues and jazz. He just kind of moves into a commercial vein that works for him. And you gotta love Sam the Man Taylor. And if you haven't heard him, he's the guy you should pick up. You never gotta pay too much for one of his albums. Next guy we're gonna talk about was a guy whose impact was far greater than I realized. And what I'm also realizing is that some of these guys, as I made the list, I kind of went by what I knew already. You know, this is kind of my perception of things, how they are now. These are the guys I know a lot about. And I think that's almost a fairly honest way to do it. Because if I know only limited about it, I can assume most other people are going to know fairly little about that artist as well. And it all depends on how deep you are into this music. But again, the measuring stick here is always going to be the broadness of the U.S. jazz labels. Those 15, 16 major jazz labels that for me is the body of the work. There's lots infinite of small labels that contribute pieces. But these 15, 16 labels are really the body of the jazz canon. In 50 to 65, let's say. And some labels disappear in that time frame, others pop up. But for the most part, this is the Coltrane, Miles, Charlie Parker universe. It's kind of in this 15, 16 label universe. So if you have a record as a leader in these ensembled labels, that's kind of how you got on this list. As most of you know, I have most of the records on those labels. And for the 50s, I pretty much have everything on those labels. It thins out in the 60s on some of them. But this is Red Holloway. And so what I'm trying to say is that as I got into this, some of these cats are far more important than I realized. This is number 99, Red Holloway. A name that isn't going to be too familiar to most people, but his pedigree is incredible. May 31, 1927, he was born in Helena, Arkansas. He moves to Chicago at a pretty young age, goes to DuSable High School, Walter Diet fame. We've heard me speak about the teacher who was the protege to a lot of great black musicians. He plays with Johnny Griffin in school, that Chicago connection. 46, he joins the Army, comes back to Chicago, starts playing with Yusef Lateef, Sonny Stitt, Dexter Gordon, Billie Holiday, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Ben Webster, Jimmy Rushin, Dakota Staton, Eddie Cleanhead Vinson, Sonny Rollins, Lester Young, Red Rodney, Red Fox, B.B. King, B.B. Bland, and Bobby Bland, and Aretha Franklin. You might know a few of those names. Red Holloway was all over the place. Kind of took me by surprise. I don't always read lineups, but I thought I did. But he's on a lot of places with a lot of guys. He ends up playing with Memphis Slim, who's a guy I love, a blues singer with just a ton of feel. And then he plays with Jack McDuff as well, I believe in the 70s, maybe even late 60s. So Red Holloway really has a strong pedigree, not a super big discography. This is also on the Prestige label, $72.99, $73.25. So they're pretty close together. And for the most part, a lot of these guys I come to them excuse me, hold on. But for a lot of these guys, I come to them because I was filling in the label discographies. So as I got close to 7,300, I'm like, well, the last 72.99, I need to get that, finish off 7,200 series. And I didn't buy them numerically. You know, I plugged in the major artists first, thought that was enough. Then I started adding more peripheral sidemen stuff. And eventually you're like, well, I got 65 of the 96, maybe I should just get the rest. And you learn about some pretty great talent that way. Red Holloway, a guy that, like I said, he's probably deserving to be known more so than he is. A guy whose record I had to re-listen to the other day while I was pulling records. And this record, Buddy Terry, number 98, is a pretty special record. It's the only record by him I have. I think there might be one other one, either on Prestige or somewhere, if I remember looking when I looked. But born January 30, 1941 in Newark. So during the war he's born. But it's a bit of a later generation. This record, Electric Soul, is outstanding. He does have another one somewhere. I remember seeing the cover. He is an alto and a tenor player. In the 70s, he actually put out 3 albums on Mainstream. So I think there's one more Prestige and those 3 Mainstream records. And there's not a lot of information on this guy that I found in my quick search. And I can only spend so much time digging. So I figured we'd talk about this record some. The sidemen on here are kind of noteworthy. Jimmy Owens, Harold Mayburn, Ron Carter, and Freddie Watts. And he also plays the baritone at times. And it's just a fun blues at the train station. You know, number 7525, which puts this probably 66, 67 even? 67. I'm getting to know the numerical numbers and being able to tell what year that area is from, generally speaking. They get better and better at it too. But it's a great record. They play the blues, they lay it down. Okay? See what I'm saying? What I like about Prestige records is that you kind of know what you're getting, especially after 7,200 or so. Prior to that, there's a little bit more fluctuation in what they're doing. But after 7,200, if you're on that 7,000 series, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Soul, blues, gospel inflected, organs for breakfast, kind of, you want some Tabasco with your hangover kind of thing. Next guy we're going to talk about is the great Sidney Bechet. And I've done an episode on him, so I'll probably put a link to him. Because he's a guy worthy of digging out. And while he was a clarinetist, he was also a sax player. And I was a little bit on the fence about including him. But when it came down to it, his innovations as soloist absolutely made him an essential part of this list. He doesn't have a large body of work, I found out when I made my episode on. It doesn't have just volumes and volumes of stuff. Alfred Lion does put out quite a bit of material by him. But most, if not all of it, is live stuff from his time in Paris. This is on the Riverside label. And then the stuff at the Olympia. This is all French recordings that Blue Note managed to get a license to and issued them. And so I didn't realize at first that they weren't really recording Sidney and that he wasn't really a member of the Blue Note stable really in that sense. But as an innovator and as a guy that can play and as a guy that directly linked to Armstrong, he brings the innovations of Armstrong to the Reed family. And I think without question, he's one of the most enjoyable players out there. So that's Sidney Bechet. Number 96 is a guy by the name of Wild Bill Moore. And here's yet another guy whose impact on the music and pedigree was much greater than I realized. Wild Bill Moore was born in Detroit in June 13, 1918. He was born in Detroit. He was a boxer and Golden Gloves. He was a pretty successful guy at that. But he ends up hearing Parker, I believe, and Charlie Christian, and he decides he wants to be a musician. He plays with a guy by the name of a gal by the name of Christine Chapman, who I believe was married to Slim Memphis. And he ends up playing with Slim at some point too. 45 to 47, he's in LA recording kind of R&B-ish stuff, but also Slim Galliard, Dexter Gordon, and others. He was inspired by Illinois Jacquet, one of the great Texas tenors. And so he's kind of in that vein of the Texas tenors without really being a Texan. But he does wear the cowboy hat. You'll see some pictures of him wearing the cowboy hat. Not on either of these ones, but I've seen a picture of him in a cowboy hat. He has these 2 records on Jazzland, because he goes back to Detroit, ends up on the East Coast after his time in LA. And he plays on Marvin Gaye's Mercy, Mercy Me from the What's Going On record. One of the great soul, one of the great records of all time. And that's Wild Bill Moore playing the sax on Mercy, Mercy Me. That's noteworthy in and of itself. He also plays with Big Joe Turner, and he's on a couple of his big hits, including, was it Shake Around and Roll? I can't remember. But anyway, that's Wild Bill Moore. 2 Jazzline records in the jazz discography lexicon, but a name that is on a lot of places than one would realize. Marion Brown, for me, is number 95. And this guy delves in the avant-garde fairly deeply. And one of the things I want to drive home in this episode and throughout this series is the link between higher secondary education and the avant-garde. It's actually pretty surprising how many of the guys that go to the edges of the music actually had the education and the training to be able to do it. And it has 2 causes, or repercussions is a better word. One, it allows them to kind of dissect and push the music into strange places, but it also diverts the fuel of the music away from feel and just reacting and responding within the moment to more of a thought-out, machine-like approach, looking at the math and being divisive. And a guy like Lockjaw Davis, who never had any music training, played the blues, and he was fantastic at it and never had to do more than just that. But guys who have knowledge of music tend to start chafing at the bit and dissecting it. And you look at that wave of cats that comes in the 60s, most of those guys had music education that propelled the avant-garde. And the earlier generations of black musicians were often far less, especially secondary music education. A lot of them did have some schooling, but it feels like this generation was enveloped in the New York political scene, the roots of Africa. This new kind of global jet age was upon us. We had this new kind of concept of our place. And the black avant-garde musician was connecting with Africa, the music and the rhythms of Africa, the pulses and the accentuations of tribal music, connecting it with the black struggle here in America. But it does become a very cerebral thing. And I think as I've matured as a listener, my respect for the guys who play just with feeling is actually grown immensely. And the guys who are disseminating the music, while my respect for their knowledge and what they're doing is still there, it's not something I listen to nearly as frequently. And I think there is kind of a conflict between thinking and feeling. I think that's kind of true in athletics on some degree. You know, it's sometimes you gotta trust what you feel, and sometimes you gotta trust what you think, and it's not always gonna be in sync. But a guy like Marion Brown kind of drives that home. He has quite the pedigree here. Born September 8, 1931. He plays alto. He's also a composer from Atlanta, Georgia. He's the grandson of an escaped slave from the Georgia Sea Islands. So if you were a slave on the Georgia Sea Islands, off the coast of Savannah in that area, running away was a tough thing to do. He was raised by a single mom. He heard Parker at a young age. In the 10th grade, he joins the Army for 2 years. He's stationed in Hokkaido, Japan. Probably in Sapporo, I would have to guess. Home of the famous Sapporo beer. In 56, he comes back and he's in Atlanta. Goes to the school of Clark College. Then he ends up in Howard in D.C. He hears Coltrane, Ornette, Archie Shepp. In 62, he's in New York. He ends up starting to play with a lot of these guys. He becomes friends with Amiri Baraka. And it's conversations with Baraka and Archie Shepp where they start talking to him about the sound of Africa and the avant-garde and the tribalism and the connections between all of it. There's a connection between the avant-garde and intellectualism. And like I said, this is not a criticism. This is a recognition, a realization, an epiphany of sorts. And it was always kind of known to me that the avant-garde was connected with an illiterate part of the music. But in doing this, what I'm seeing is that almost all of these guys who delve into the avant-garde, even guys like Herbie Hancock, they have a really strong, probably almost too much knowledge about music. And it's what separates the blues and the swing era from the avant-garde era. You know, I think in the case of jazz and swing and the blues, too much knowledge can be a bad thing. And what it creates might also be wonderful and is, but it almost has a hard time coexisting with the simplicity and basic approach of the blues. I want to play with some feel and some gut and tell you a story. I don't need to have 17 chord changes to do that. I need to have 3 bars, and I'm going to tell you my story, because that's what I'm here to do. This is a vehicle for me getting this out. And I think sometimes when the music becomes very cerebral, feeling gets really squelched and pushed aside for intellect and sometimes ego. And I think ego drives white players far more than black players, just because of the background that they come from. Virtuosity, ability, sometimes is what fuels their engine to show how great they can be for the sake of that. Money can be a fuel, a motivating engine. Sorrow, to me, is the most powerful motivating engine. And that struggle, and that almost always, the more struggle you got, the more you almost seem to stay in the blues. So I don't want to belabor that point too much, but it is interesting when you think about it. So now we're moving on to number 94. This is an interesting record. By the way, 3 for Shep. You know, that's what we're listening to. And definitely a complex cat, Marion Brown. And he was at it for a long time doing his thing. So a guy I have a lot of respect for those guys. You know, Amari Baraka, Archie Shep, sitting in Washington Square talking about the future of the black race. You know, there's nothing easy about that. Jesse Powell. Another guy that, relatively unknown. That's his one record on Jubilee, and I think he has one on Prestige. Probably about 1960s, 5 or 6. He's born February 2, 1924, which is Groundhog's Day, same day as my mother, interestingly. Born in Dallas, Texas, which loosely makes him a Texas tenorman. He's not one of the first names you hear associated with that sound, but he definitely fits in that niche. He worked with Hot Lips Page and Louis Armstrong early on, so that's pretty strong pedigree. In '46, he joined Basie, replacing his idol Illinois Jacquette, who is the leader of the Texas tenor sound. In the late 40s, he starts playing with a lot of blues artists, recording with guys like Brownie McGhee, Doc Thomas, Champion Jack Dupree, who I'm a big fan of. He goes to France in 1948, backing the great Howard McGhee, one of my favorite trumpet players who people don't speak about very much. He plays with Dizzy in 1949, because everybody plays with Dizzy, as we're now learning. And then in the 50s, he moves kind of more to an R&B sound. Yeah, here he's playing on the Jubilee label, and this cooks. You know, it's a pretty grooving party here. No easy looking at who the names are on the band. But he definitely is a guy that knows how to play some rhythm and blues. He wouldn't have played with Armstrong and Hot Lips and all those great names, did he not? And so again, it's a guy that he played with Basie, you know, and yet we hardly know the name Jesse Powell. And Basie, it does seem, is going to be sort of the black equivalent of the Woody Herman and Stan Kenton orc bands for the white guys. And let's also mention this. It would be a whole lot tougher to be breaking down white sax players and black sax players if they were recording together, if bands were integrated. But for the most part, they still weren't in this era. And it's kind of like comparing Negro League stats to Major League stats. Well, we gotta compare them because they weren't really playing together. See what I'm saying? Their works were very separate. And like I said, one of the things I realized making the White series was part of why you guys are all obscure, because all these white cats played with other white cats, and the entire subgenre has kind of lost some credibility in the eyes of today's writers, critics, and reviewers, which is somewhat justified. For a lot of those cats, the Bob Hardaways, the Eddie Schulmans, jazz was something they did as a young guy, and it was a stepping stone to what they did later in their career. To Lockjaw Davis, you had to pry that horn out of his hands on his deathbed. See what I'm saying? It's a very different experience with jazz, different relationship with jazz. Especially when you're a blues guy, this is what you're going to do. This is where your soul has you. This is Eddie Chambly. Chambly. Not really sure I've even ever heard it said. With Dayton Shelby at the organ. That could be a girl, but I don't know. Let's see if I can find real quick. I'm not going to be so lucky. But this is Prestige number 7,321. So we're talking the beginning of the soul swing era for the soul jazz era for Prestige, 72, 7,300, right in the thick of that soul organ jazz movement. But who is Eddie Chambly, number 93? Well, February 24th, 1920, he was born in Atlanta. He's a tenor and an alto player. He grows up in Chicago. Southside, baby. 41 to 46, he's in the Army. He leaves the Army. He starts performing on early R&B hits for a guy named Sonny Thompson. Put a couple of #1 hits in the mid to late 40s. He works with Dinah Washington for a long time as one of her backing musicians. And that leads him to being on the Emersy label, where he also records a couple labels. And he also plays with the great Lionel Hampton. And of course, Lionel Hampton is one of those cats that was such a great virtuosity that there's no way you play with Lionel Hampton without really having the pedigree to do so. Here's one of the Emersy records for Eddie Chambly. He has another one that's a little later than this, I think, in the series, or maybe a little earlier. By 36-100, I'm missing a few titles. The first 100 Emersys, I think I have them all now. There was a few compilations I had yet to get, and I think I've recently found both those for a couple bucks. Chambly's a great player. He, like I said, he works with Dinah on a lot of those great Emersy recordings of hers. He was briefly married to her, interestingly enough. He also plays with T-Bone Walker, who's a great kind of blues, jazz, crossover artist. Not a name people are going to be super familiar with, but if you look at that look on his face there, everything about this man's tone seems in lockstep with that face. When I see that smile right there, when I see what he's saying to me through that grin, it's an easygoing guy with a love of life. You know, that's pretty apparent to me. Next guy we're going to talk about is the great Earl Bostick, number 92. And Bostick is a name I first come across because John Coltrane plays with him in the 40s, I believe. And I'm like, who's this Earl Bostick guy? And so I dug out a few of his records over years. And he's a lot of these records are on the King label. And I find most King, excuse me, dry throat, King jazz to be kind of R&B-ish, which is definitely where Earl Bostick is. A great player. Definitely has that fiery R&B propulsive tone. Seems like my cat might have peed on that plastic sleeve last night. So now I gotta check all my records out there. I got 100 piles of records out there, goddammit. Cats, you love them, but they pretty much destroy your life every chance they get. Earl Bostick, number 92, April 25, 1913. Born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which actually kind of makes him, for my money, almost a Texas tenor. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Texas, they're kind of very interwoven. It's part of the whole Texas tenor thing. There's a real R&B inflection to what you're doing, and Bostick's absolutely that. He first records with Lionel Hampton, believe it or not. He's mostly an alto player. He plays with Arnett Cobb, another Texas tenor. He plays with Hot Lips Page, Rex Stewart, Don Bias, Charlie Christian, Thelonious Monk, Cab Calloway, and others. His first recording with Lionel Hampton was with Charlie Christian. Remember, Goodman discovered both those two, and Clyde Hart and Big Sick Catlett on bass and drums. And so Bostick playing with Hampton, Charlie Christian, and those other two, that's a pretty serious little group. He was a regular at Minton's in the late 40s as bebop was developing itself, which is interesting. But he turns to R&B in the late 40s, has big hits with songs like Cherokee, Temptation, Harlem Nocturne was his song, even though Sam the Man Taylor does it, Flamingo. He arranges for everybody. And just a great band leader, a great soulful dance music, party album guy. His records are always kind of beat and don't go for much because they sold pretty fucking well. King Records out of Cincinnati sold a lot of Bostick leading up to James Brown. You know, and again, when you have Coltrane in your ranks as a young man, that tells you something about the great Earl Bostick. And Coltrane was definitely a developing talent at that age of his career. But I'm a pretty big Bostick fan, no question about it. Always enjoyed listening to Earl Bostick. This is number 91. And another guy kind of on the edges. Ken McIntyre. And this is on New Jazz 8259. This is on New Jazz 8247. This one's with Eric Dolphy, which is going to tell you something about Ken McIntyre right there. Who's on the trombone there? John Mancebo Lewis. Don't even know that name. You know, it's crazy. And the other thing I kind of realized today is that we're talking about 150 saxophone players, okay, that made it onto the great jazz labels as leaders. 150, and there's some I've missed, I'm sure. But from 1950 to 1965 or so, these were like 150 guys that played the saxophone that got albums as leaders on these great labels. Prestige, Blue Note, Riverside, Argo, Embassy, Contemporary, Pacific, all those great labels, all right? Of those 150, that's probably a bit like Major League Baseball in terms of the percentage of guys in the big leagues versus the number of guys in the minor leagues. 90% of the jazz players in America never got records as a leader. I would guess 60% never recorded. Half of them just simply played in bands, made a few bucks, partied, had a good time, and might have been local or regional legends, made it on some small obscure label that no one remembers. But I would guess of that 150, that's probably 5-10% of the number of guys playing saxophone professionally, both white and black, in that era. So what we remember and what we have on documented vinyl is probably 10% at best of the players who were out there playing. And many of them had to be great. Just never got the break, weren't in the right place at the right time, died young. Infinite reasons why a guy could be a very talented player, but he was in a great band that paid well. So he didn't push the issue and just toured and made money, played locally, had kids, whatever. There's 1,000 reasons why a guy wouldn't dive into that next step of being on a contract with a label and having obligations and having to leave things behind like wives, kids, local gigs, local band that you're very entrenched in. So I'm guessing 10%-ish, maybe, of the great players in that era made it to record as a leader, and maybe 20-25% at most got to record as a sideman. You know, the number of baseball players that make it from the minor leagues to the major leagues is a small number, and some guys come back and forth and stay kind of intermittent. So it's got to be kind of the same with the jazz ranks, both black and white. So anyway, Ken McIntyre is a great player. Definitely was an exploratory kind of guy. His engine was very avant-garde-ish. He was born September 7, 1931. Boston. Making him one of the few black Bostonians in jazz. He plays the alto. He plays the flute. He plays the bass clarinet. He plays the oboe. He plays the bassoon. He plays the bass, drums, and the piano. What are you missing there, Kenny McIntyre? You want to pick up guitar? You don't need nobody. You were born 50 years later, you'd be in your basement making all these records by your damn self. But he ends up going into the Army, comes back, joins the Boston Conservatory, studies with guys like G.G. Grice and Charlie Mariano. In the 60s, he records these records with Dolphy, and then Next year he becomes a public school teacher. And he stays a public school teacher for years. And even though he comes back to record at some times, it sounds like he stayed an educator for a long time, which is one of the things that black musicians end up doing if their music career doesn't pan out or pay enough. White guys go to casinos, go work in Hollywood. The black guys go teach in a black school in Detroit or Boston. He played with Jackie Byard, plays with Bill Dixon, Cecil Taylor, Nat Adderley, Charlie Hayden. There's some pretty edgy names there with Taylor and Hayden especially. He has some LPs on Steeplechase in the 70s. I think there's 5 of them. And he has some noteworthy recordings then that are pretty good as well. I've only heard a little bits of them, just kind of gleaning them on the internet. But and I do want to mention here right now that I'm putting links to Amazon for most of these artists now. And if you click on the link and go buy something, it doesn't even have to be what I linked to. It can be anything. Once you've linked from my page, I'll make $1 on your purchase, $2, depending on how much you spend. And it'll be another revenue source stream for me. And like I said, it's getting to that point where either you need to go back to work or find a way to make a living doing this. Patreon's growing, thankfully. It can only grow so fast. You know, it's got to be organic or it won't sustain itself. But making a few bucks now on YouTube. I haven't got paid yet, but it's starting to 50 cents $1 a day there. And now this Amazon thing, I've been on it for 4 days, and it's already made me a little bit of money. So if you're interested in something I talk about, click on a link in Amazon and then go find the version you want to buy, and it'll kick me back a percentage, which will help. So, and thank you to Doug, who kind of brought me through that process and taught me how to do it. Very thankful and indebted to you. And I should probably send you a message on Patreon thanking you for that. But again, this is how we do. So this is the first 10 in this series. And one of the things that really kind of was apparent is most of these guys had much deeper pedigrees and had more important gigs and played with influential people more so than their fame would let you think. And on that list there, Marion Brown and probably Ken McIntyre are probably the most common in guys' collections today. Let's take one more look here. Holloway, Terry, Sam the Man, Bechet, Wild Boar. Yeah, so probably Marion Brown's the one name that a lot of people would know probably the most. And again, I'm going to put out the avant-garde guys down some because it's a barley wine and its reach is limited. And we want this to be for everybody so they know, yeah, this is where this guy belongs. And I don't have to like it because it's number 3 on the list. You know, 95, it's great if you like that. That's the point. Anyway, appreciate you all. Be safe. Check out Patreon. Again, my episode Throat Grabbers yesterday got banned here in America for copyright reasons. It's up on my Facebook page. Message me if you don't have a link to that. I'd love for you to see it. It's a great run through some really fun records. I enjoyed making it. Talk to you soon. Peace.